The consulate's waiting room, typically a hushed anteroom to the government's inner workings, now seethed like a crucible under immense pressure. The air, heavy with the scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies, bristled with a raw collective dread. Starved, fear-etched faces pivoted towards Chiune Sugihara as he entered, a communal gasp rippling through the close-packed figures. He moved with an ingrained composure, his dark suit a stark counterpoint to the refugees' faded, road-weary garments. A solitary, elevated window cast an anemic, slate-grey light, highlighting the stark desperation in their eyes. He recalled the early phase of this crisis, when appeals were hesitant, almost apologetic. Now, they cascaded, a frantic torrent of pleas for survival. Telegrams from Tokyo were unequivocal. No visas without proper documentation or onward travel arrangements. Yet gazing at these individuals, mothers clutching children, old men with tremulous hands, he knew he couldn't simply dismiss them. A young woman, no older than his own daughter, stepped forward, her voice a fragile whisper. "Please, sir, we have nowhere left. The borders they are closing." Her petition was met with a murmurous echo, a swelling tide of anguish. Sugihara raised a hand, a silent request for quiet. "I comprehend your plight," he stated, his voice measured, revealing none of his inner turmoil. "I am exerting every effort." This was a carefully crafted half-truth, a diplomatic evasion. His true struggle was with his conscience, balancing his government's rigid directives against the undeniable human suffering before him. He retreated to his office, the weighty oak door closing behind him like a definitive pronouncement. Inside, the stillness offered a welcome balm, a brief respite from the urgent demands beyond. Sugihara approached his desk, the polished wood reflecting the subdued illumination. He took up his pen, a familiar reassuring weight in his hand, and stared at the pristine visa forms. Each sheet represented a life, a family, a future teetering on a precipice. The ink in his pen felt charged, imbued with the gravity of decisions he knew he shouldn't undertake, but could not elude. Tokyo's instructions were absolute, their logic cold and inflexible. The empire's security must be paramount, resources are strained. Do not issue visas without proper documentation. He could almost hear Ambassador Oshima's precise, authoritative tone. But the refugees' faces, etched with stark terror, were equally absolute. Their needs to them were paramount. He remembered a discussion with his wife Yukiko just last night. The sounds of their children's laughter had been a poignant backdrop to the hushed, urgent nature of their conversation. "You must follow your heart, Chiune," she had said, her hand resting gently on his arm. "This isn't solely about rules, is it?" Her words had resonated deeply, igniting a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. Sugihara closed his eyes for a moment, envisioning his own children. What if they faced such peril? What if their sole hope rested on a stranger's kindness, a bureaucrat bound by regulations? The chilling thought solidified his resolve. Rules were man-made, humanity transcended them. He opened his eyes, a new determination hardening his gaze. He drew a blank visa form towards him, the crisp paper a stark white canvas. He wrote the date, his hand steady. Then, he began to write the names, one after another, completing the fields with meticulous precision. He signed each one, his signature, a small act of defiance, a personal declaration against an indifferent bureaucracy. The initial few were slow, each pen stroke a deliberate act of will, but a rhythm soon emerged. The names blurred into a ceaseless stream of humanity, each one, a life he sought to preserve. His wrist began to ache, his fingers growing stiff, yet he pressed on, propelled by an unseen force. He worked through lunch, through the afternoon, the growing stack of completed visas beside him. Outside, the waiting room remained a tableau of anxious hope. Word had begun to filter through the throng, a hushed whisper carried on the stale air. "He is doing it! He is writing them." The initial despair gradually yielded to cautious optimism, a fragile bloom in their harsh reality. A young boy, perhaps 7, pressed his face against the glass of Sugihara's office door, his breath fogging the pane. He watched the diplomat's tireless hand, moving with almost mechanical precision. The boy's mother, her face still drawn with worry, gently pulled him back. "Give him space, my dear, he is helping us." Quote, as dusk descended, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, Sugihara finally pushed away from his desk. His eyes felt gritty, his back ached, but a profound sense of purpose had settled over him. He surveyed the stacks of signed visas, a small mountain of hope. He had written hundreds, perhaps even 1,000. He didn't know the exact count, nor did he care. Each was a testament to a life, a future. He gathered the completed forms, his arms full, and pushed open the heavy door to the waiting room. A collective gasp, unlike the one that had greeted him earlier, swept through the room. A gasp of awe, disbelief, and profound gratitude. Sugihara approached the young woman who had spoken to him first. He extended a visa. "Here," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "For you and your family." Her hands trembled as she took the document, her eyes wide with unshed tears. She looked at the signature, then back at him, her lips forming a silent, "Thank you." Then, a ripple of movement. A man stepped forward, then another, then a woman, all extending their hands, their faces alight with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Sugihara began to distribute the visas, moving through the crowd, his gaze meeting theirs, acknowledging their shared humanity. The process was slow, each exchange a moment of deep connection. He saw relief wash over their faces, tension draining from their shoulders. He heard choked sobs, murmured blessings in languages he didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. As the last visa was handed out, the room, though still crowded, felt lighter, imbued with a nascent joy. The air, once thick with anxiety, now hummed with a quiet exhilaration. Sugihara looked around, his gaze lingering on the faces of the people he had helped. Their journey was far from over, but he had given them a start, a chance. A small, elderly woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, approached him. She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and pressed a small, worn wooden bird into his palm. "For good luck," she whispered, her eyes shining. "You are a kind man, sir, a very kind man." Sugihara looked at the bird, then back at the woman, a warmth spreading through him. He knew the risks he had taken, the orders he had defied. He knew the potential repercussions for his career, for his family. But in that moment, holding the small wooden bird, looking into the grateful eyes of the refugees, he knew he had made the right choice. He had chosen humanity over bureaucracy, compassion over orders, and in doing so, he had found a deeper meaning, a profound purpose, in his diplomatic post. The path ahead was uncertain, but for now, for this moment, a quiet peace settled over the consulate, a beacon of hope in a darkening world. A brave choice. The air in the consulate felt thick with unspoken anxieties, each breath a shallow intake of the inevitable. Chiune sat at his desk, the silence of the room punctuated only by the scratch of his pen against the crisp consulate letterhead. He was drafting another report, a meticulous account of the growing refugee crisis, but his mind was a whirlwind of the desperate faces pressed against the wrought iron gates, the pleas echoing in his memory. Outside, the clamor of voices had intensified over the past week, a constant, mournful hum of desperation that vibrated through the very foundations of the building. Yukiko entered, her steps light but her expression heavy. She carried a tray with a steaming cup of tea, the aroma of jasmine a fleeting comfort in the oppressive atmosphere. "Another telegram just arrived," she said, her voice barely a whisper, placing the cup before him. "From Tokyo." Chiune's hand, reaching for the tea, paused. He didn't need to open it to know its contents. The previous 3 had been unequivocal. No transit visas for refugees without proper destination visas. Strict adherence to protocol. He pushed the cup aside, the jasmine scent now acrid in his nostrils. "Read it to me, Yukiko." She unfolded the thin paper, her eyes scanning the familiar bureaucratic language. "It reiterates the previous directives, Chiune-san. Unauthorized issuance of visas will result in severe disciplinary action. National security is paramount." Her voice faltered at the end, the official pronouncements a stark contrast to the human suffering they ignored. He closed his eyes, picturing the faces again. The elderly woman with a threadbare shawl, her eyes wide with a terror he recognized from newsreels of Europe. The young man, barely older than his own son, clutching a faded photograph. The children, their small hands reaching through the bars. He had seen fear before, but never on this scale, never so raw and immediate. "The Ministry of Foreign Affairs will not budge," Chiune stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet underlaid with a tremor of despair. "They prioritize regulations over humanity. They see numbers, not lives." He pushed himself away from the desk, pacing the small confines of his office. Each step felt like a compromise, each moment of inaction a betrayal. Yukiko watched him, her own heart heavy. She knew the burden he carried, the sleepless nights spent wrestling with his conscience. "What will you do, Chiune-san?" He stopped by the window, peering through the lace curtains at the throng below. The sun, usually a source of warmth, felt like an interrogation lamp, illuminating their despair. "I cannot simply watch them perish," he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity. "I cannot be an accomplice to this cruelty." He turned, his gaze meeting hers, a fierce resolve hardening his features. "I will issue the visas." Yukiko's breath hitched. She knew the magnitude of his decision, the personal and professional risks. But the ministry. "The ministry is far away," Chiune interrupted, his voice firm, "and these people are here, on my doorstep, begging for life. My conscience will not allow me to turn them away." He walked back to his desk, pulling out a fresh stack of blank transit visa forms. His hands, which usually moved with a meticulous, almost surgical precision, now trembled slightly as he uncapped his pen. "We will start immediately. Prioritize families with children, then the most vulnerable." Quote, the first few visas were the slowest. Each stroke of the pen, a deliberate act of defiance. He filled in the blanks, his elegant calligraphy transforming official documents into lifelines. The ink flowed, each signature a quiet rebellion. He asked Yukiko to organize the queue, explaining to the first few bewildered refugees that transit visas would be issued. A ripple of disbelief, then a wave of hesitant hope, spread through the crowd. Word spread like wildfire. The initial trickle of refugees at the consulate gates swelled into a torrent. The courtyard, then the street, became a sea of expectant faces. Chiune worked tirelessly, his hand aching, his eyes burning. He filled out forms, his pen scratching rhythmically, the sound, a counterpoint, to the hushed murmurs of gratitude. He stamped each visa with a heavy thud, a sound that resonated with newfound hope. He called on his wife, Yukiko, and even his children, to help. Hiroki, his eldest son, was tasked with sorting the completed visas, his small hands carefully stacking the precious documents. Yukiko, ever the steady anchor, helped manage the flow, translating urgent requests, and offering what little comfort she could. She saw the toll it was taking on him, the lines of fatigue deepening around his eyes, but she also saw a light in them, a quiet strength she admired more than ever. Days blurred into a continuous cycle of signing, stamping, and passing the precious papers through the open window. Chiune's hand cramped, his wrist ached, but he pushed through the pain. He could not stop. Each face that passed the window, each whispered, "Thank you," was fuel for his conviction. The sheer volume of applications was overwhelming, and the time was running out. He knew his official posting in Kaunas was nearing its end. The consulate was due to close. The final day arrived with a grim finality. The consulate was officially closed, the Japanese flag lowered for the last time. But Chiune was not done. He continued to issue visas from his hotel room, then from the train station platform, even as the train prepared to depart. He stood on the steps of the train, leaning out the window, a stack of blank visa forms in one hand, his pen in the other. He signed and stamped, throwing the completed visas to outstretched hands, his voice hoarse from shouting instructions. The train whistle shrieked, a piercing sound that signaled the end. The last visa fluttered from his hand, caught by a desperate refugee. As the train pulled away, leaving behind a trail of steam and a cacophony of shouts, Chiune watched the faces recede. He had signed thousands, far more than he could count. He had defied orders, risked his career and potentially his family's safety. But looking back at the faces, now filled with a fragile dawning hope, he knew, with an absolute certainty, that he had made the only choice he could. The weight of the world had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had chosen courage over compliance, humanity over bureaucracy, and in doing so, he had saved lives. His gaze swept over the diminishing crowd, a silent promise hanging in the air. He had done what was right. The train gathered speed, carrying him away from Kaunas, but not from the memory of those faces, or the profound choice he had made. Writing for freedom, the scent of stale ink and old paper, usually a familiar comfort, today held a sharper tang for Chiune. The metallic edge of fear. The small, cluttered office within the Japanese consulate in Kaunas thrummed with a nervous energy that even the thick walls couldn't entirely contain. Beyond, the city's sounds remained a distant hum, but within, a different kind of storm was brewing. Yukiko, ever practical, set down a fresh pot of green tea, the delicate steam briefly veiling her worried expression. "More refugees, Chiune-san," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "The line stretches down the street, past the bakers, even beyond the tailors." Chiune nodded, his gaze fixed on the imposing stack of official documents on his desk. Each one, a crisp, white refusal. "And Tokyo's directives remain unchanged," quote, he stated, his words flat and heavy. "No transit visas without a confirmed destination country, without an entry permit already secured." The sheer absurdity of it choked him. How could these desperate souls, fleeing the Nazi onslaught, obtain entry to a nation that hadn't yet agreed to receive them? It was a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to ensnare, not to assist. He picked up a blank visa application, the paper cool beneath his fingertips. His pen, a simple black instrument, felt like a leaden weight. A tentative yet urgent knock sounded at the door. Yukiko opened it to reveal a small group, their faces etched with exhaustion and a fragile hope. From their midst, a young man, perhaps no older than 20, stepped forward. He clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest. "Sugihara-sama," the young man began, his voice raspy. "My name is Mendelssohn. My family, we've come from Poland. We heard you were helping." Chiune's heart ached with a familiar pang. He knew their stories, recognized the terror in their eyes. He cleared his throat. "I am doing what I can, Mr. Mendelssohn, but the requirements." He gestured vaguely towards the pile of grim denials. Mendelssohn's dark, haunted eyes pleaded. "We have nowhere else to go. The Soviets, they only offer a return to the West, to the Germans. You are our last hope." Chiune glanced at his wife, then back at the young man. The official channels were decisively closed, but what if there was an alternative? A flicker of an idea, audacious and perilous, began to coalesce. He recalled a conversation with a colleague, a technicality, a loophole barely wide enough to slip through. A transit visa to a third country, provided that country was willing. Curaçao. A distant Dutch colony, a world away. He picked up a blank visa form again, but this time, his focus wasn't on the official stamps. He saw the empty lines awaiting inscription, the space for a destination. "Mr. Mendelssohn," Chiune said, his voice now imbued with a firmer resolve, "do you know of Curaçao?" Mendelssohn blinked, a spark of confusion, momentarily eclipsing his despair. "Curaçao? I have heard the name, a Dutch island." "Indeed," Chiune confirmed. He turned the form over, his mind racing. The Dutch consul Jan Zwartendijk had issued a few permits to Curaçao, fully aware they were symbolic. They offered no actual entry, but they provided a destination. A destination Chiune could then leverage as the basis for a transit visa through Japan. It was a flimsy span, yet a bridge nonetheless. He looked at Yukiko. Her eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew the immense risk. He was defying explicit orders, jeopardizing his career, their family's future. But she also knew his unyielding conscience. "We will need to work swiftly," Chiune instructed, speaking directly to Mendelssohn but addressing the invisible throng outside. "Tell your people to secure a Curaçao endorsement from the Dutch consul, even a symbolic one. It will be our key." The news ignited like wildfire through the refugee community. Hope, a fragile precious bloom, began to unfurl. Within hours, a new queue snaked outside the Dutch consulate, then a new, even longer one, outside the Japanese. Chiune labored tirelessly, his hand ached, but he continued writing. Each stroke of his pen was a small act of rebellion, a tiny chip at the mountain of despair. He signed visas for families, for individuals, for children whose parents had already vanished into the abyss. He inscribed Curaçao as the destination, knowing it was a fabrication, but a life-saving one. Yukiko, and even their young son Hiroki, assisted. Hiroki, usually boisterous, sat quietly, carefully stamping official seals onto the visas, his small hands surprisingly steady. Yukiko organized the papers, kept the tea flowing, and offered encouraging words to the weary refugees who passed through their small office. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with a different kind of energy. Purpose. Days blurred into nights. Chiune barely slept, his fingers cramped, his eyes burning from the incessant paperwork. The consulate, typically a quiet bastion of diplomacy, had been transformed into a desperate factory of salvation. He received urgent telegrams from Tokyo, each a thinly veiled warning, reminding him of his duty, of the strict protocols. He filed them away, unread. His true duty, he realized, lay not with the distant bureaucracy, but with the human lives standing before him. One afternoon, a weary Japanese official from Tokyo, Mr. Tanaka, arrived unannounced. He was a stern man, his uniform impeccably pressed, his expression grim. "Sugihara-san," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, "Tokyo is most displeased. These irregularities cannot continue." Chiune looked up from the visa he was signing, his eyes bloodshot but resolute. "Tanaka-san, these are not irregularities, these are human beings, they are fleeing certain death." Tanaka's gaze hardened. "Orders are orders, Sugihara-san. You are jeopardizing your career, your family's standing. Japan's neutrality. Japan's honor." Chiune countered, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "What honor is there in turning away those in need?" Tanaka said nothing more, only shook his head, a mixture of disapproval, and perhaps a flicker of something else, reluctant admiration in his eyes. He watched Chiune sign another visa, then turned and left, the distinct click of his shoes echoing in the suddenly silent office. Chiune returned to his task. He knew the consequences. He knew the risk. But as he looked at the next face in line, a young woman clutching a baby, her eyes wide with fear and a desperate, fragile hope, he knew he couldn't stop. His pen moved across the paper, a tireless instrument of defiance, carving out pathways to freedom, one signature at a time. The ink flowed, a dark river against the white paper, carrying with it the weight of lives, the fervent hope of a future. The air in the consulate office, usually thick with the scent of old paper and stale tea, now thrummed with a different kind of tension. Sugihara sat at his desk, his usually meticulous hair slightly disheveled, the faint lines around his eyes deepened by sleepless nights. Outside, the clamor of the growing crowd of refugees was a constant, desperate hum. Their pleas, in a cacophony of languages, were a mournful symphony that had become the soundtrack to his defiance. He looked at Yukiko, her face a mask of resolute calm, meticulously stamping another visa. Their children, confined to the back rooms, were mercifully unaware of the full weight of the decision pressing down upon them. "Another 50, Yukiko said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear in the charged silence of the room. "We're running out of space to even stack them." Sugihara nodded, his gaze fixed on the stack of blank visa forms, each one a potential lifeline. His hand, usually steady, trembled slightly as he reached for the next one. The ink in his pen felt like liquid defiance, flowing against the tide of bureaucratic indifference. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this act of mercy was an act of insubordination. The telegrams from Tokyo had grown increasingly terse, each one a tightened noose around his diplomatic career. He was defying orders, risking everything: his position, his family's future, even their safety. Yet, looking at the hopeful, desperate faces pressed against the consulate windows, he found he couldn't stop. Just then the door creaked open, and Nishikawa, his aide, entered, his face pale, his usually crisp uniform rumpled. "Sir, the Vice Minister from Moscow. He's here. And he doesn't look pleased." Sugihara's heart gave a cold lurch. He had expected this. The net was closing. He took a deep breath, the scent of dust and fear filling his lungs. "Show him in, Nishikawa." Vice Minister Ishikawa, a man whose very presence exuded rigid adherence to protocol, strode into the office, his eyes immediately sweeping over the stacks of visas, the frantic pace of their work, and the palpable desperation emanating from the street. His gaze settled on Sugihara, cold and disapproving. "Sugihara-san," Ishikawa began, his voice devoid of warmth, "I believe you have received several communications from Tokyo regarding your unauthorized activities." He picked up one of the completed visas, his gloved fingers barely touching the paper as if it were contaminated. "You are issuing transit visas to individuals for whom we have no guarantee of onward travel. This is a gross violation of our diplomatic policy, and a direct contravention of explicit orders." Sugihara stood, meeting Ishikawa's gaze with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Vice Minister, these are not just individuals, they are human beings, facing certain death if we do not act. They are refugees, displaced by war, seeking only a chance at life." Ishikawa scoffed. Your personal sentiments, Sugihara-san, are irrelevant. Your duty is to uphold the directives of the Foreign Ministry. Your actions are jeopardizing our relations with Germany, and creating an unnecessary diplomatic incident with Russia, who are already suspicious of the large influx of foreign nationals. This must cease, immediately. He gestured to the pile of blank forms. You are to cease issuing these visas, effective this moment. All remaining forms are to be confiscated and returned to Tokyo. Quote. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Yukiko, who had been listening silently, now stepped forward, her hand gently touching Sugihara's arm. Her touch was a silent reinforcement, a shared conviction. Sugihara looked at the vice minister, then, out the window, where a young woman with a child clutched to her chest was frantically waving a tattered piece of paper. The image solidified his resolve. Vice Minister, Sugihara said, his voice firm, I understand the gravity of your instruction, however, I cannot, in good conscience, comply. These people have nowhere else to go. To deny them these visas would be to condemn them. Ishikawa's face hardened. Then you leave me no choice, Sugihara-san. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. You and your family are to prepare for your departure on the next available train to Japan. The consulate will be closed, and all operations suspended until further notice. The words were a hammer blow, but Sugihara felt a strange sense of liberation. The sword of Damocles had finally fallen. He bowed, a gesture of respect, not surrender. Understood, Vice Minister. As Ishikawa turned to leave, his expression a mixture of triumph and disdain, Sugihara's mind was already racing. He had been fired, but he was not yet silenced. He looked at Yukiko, a silent message passing between them. Their eyes met, and in her gaze, he found the strength to continue. Yukiko, he said, his voice low, gather the children. Nishikawa, we need to move the remaining forms to the hotel. We don't have much time. Quote. The news of Sugihara's dismissal spread like wildfire through the waiting crowd. A collective gasp, then a mournful wail, rose from the street. Faces that had held a fragile hope now twisted in despair. Sugihara, standing at the consulate window, watched their reactions, a knot forming in his stomach. He knew what this meant for them. He had been their last hope. But he had not given up. Not yet. He began scribbling a note on a small piece of paper, his pen flying across the surface. This is a message to my successor, he explained to Yukiko, his voice calm despite the urgency in his movements. I am instructing them to continue issuing visas until the last possible moment, using whatever means they can. I am include a detailed account of the situation, the number of visas issued, and the sheer desperation of these people. I will also make it clear that I bear full responsibility for my actions, and that they should not be held accountable for following my instruction. Yukiko watched him, her eyes filled with admiration and a quiet sorrow. They will not be bound by your instructions, Chiune. You know that. Perhaps not, he admitted, his gaze unwavering. But I must try. I must leave them no room for doubt about the moral imperative. This is a record, a testament. He sealed the note carefully, and handed it to Nishikawa. Ensure this reaches my successor, Nishikawa. It is imperative. Nishikawa, visibly shaken by the turn of events, nodded grimly. Yes, sir, I will. Quote, the next morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in muted hues, Sugihara and his family stood on the platform of the Kaunas train station. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. Their luggage, meager and hastily packed, sat beside them. The train, a long serpent of black carriages, hissed and steamed, a metallic beast awaiting its prey. But they were not alone. Despite the early hour, despite the danger, a crowd of refugees had gathered, their faces etched with gratitude and despair. They stood in a silent vigil, a solemn tribute to the man who had dared to defy. As Sugihara and his family approached the train, a man stepped forward, holding a baby wrapped in a faded shawl. He bowed deeply, then spoke in heavily accented Japanese. Sugihara-sama, he began, his voice thick with emotion. We owe you our lives. Our children will know your name. You are a hero. Sugihara, usually composed, felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the faces surrounding him, the mothers, the fathers, the children, all carrying the weight of an uncertain future, yet offering him their profound thanks. He saw the lives he had touched, the futures he had salvaged from the abyss. He bowed in return, a deep, respectful bow, unable to speak past the emotions swelling within him. As the train's whistle shrieked, a piercing cry that seemed to tear through the morning air, Sugihara turned to his family. Yukiko's eyes were glistening, but her chin was held high. The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, clung to their parents, their small faces a mixture of confusion and unease. They boarded the train, finding a compartment to themselves. Sugihara stood by the window, watching the platform, watching the faces that had become so intimately familiar. He raised his hand, a silent farewell to the hundreds of lives he had touched, and to the hundreds more he wished he could have saved. Just as the train began to pull away, a young boy, no older than his own son, broke free from the crowd, and ran alongside the carriage, his small hand outstretched. He was holding a single, crumpled visa. As the train gathered speed, the boy pointed to the visa, then to his chest, and then to Sugihara. It was a wordless message of thanks, a testament to the future Sugihara had given him. Sugihara watched until the boy was a tiny speck in the distance, until the faces on the platform blurred into an indistinct mass. He was leaving Karnas, leaving his post, leaving behind the diplomatic career he had painstakingly built. He was leaving as a disgraced diplomat, an insubordinate official. But he was also leaving as something far more profound, a hero. A man who, when faced with an impossible choice, chose humanity over protocol. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril, and the judgment of his superiors. But as he looked at his wife and children, their faces illuminated by the morning sun, he knew, with a certainty that transcended all fear, that he had made the right choice. The lasting impact. The consulate's seldom-used archive, a small room imbued with the scent of aging paper and sun-dappled dust, offered Chiune a rare respite. He traced the spines of bound ledgers, each volume a silent record of forgotten minutiae, not searching for anything specific, but for a moment of stillness. The preceding weeks of relentless activity had left a persistent tremor in his hands, a low thrum beneath his skin that refused to abate. Yukiko appeared in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Still here?" she inquired, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the city's distant murmur. He turned, a faint smile touching his lips. "Just sifting through things." His vague gesture encompassed the crowded shelves. So many regulations, so many decrees, yet life, in its infinite complexity, often finds a way to circumvent them all. She stepped inside, light catching the silver threads in her hair. Sometimes, life demands that disregard. Her gaze settled on a particular dusty patch of wall in an empty corner. "Do you recall the day the initial refugees arrived?" The stark exhaustion in their eyes, yes, but also that fragile spark of hope. "Even when our path was so unclear." Chiune nodded, the memory vivid. It was like witnessing a dam burst. A preliminary trickle, then a surging tide. And with each individual, a distinct saga. He pictured the young mother, knuckles white as she cradled her infant, her whispered gratitude in a tongue he barely understood, yet fully apprehended. The elderly scholar, spectacles askew, clutching a single, worn book, as if it were his anchor to sanity. "The dispatches from Tokyo?" Yukiko continued, her voice lowering, the ever-tightening vice. "Each one a weight pressing down. And each refusal from me another fracture in the foundation." Chiune finished, a hint of weariness in his tone. He often wondered if his superiors perceived him as a rebel, or merely a fool, perhaps both. He moved to the desk, his finger caressing the smooth, cool wood. The sheer volume. My wrist ached for weeks afterward. And the ink seemed to cling to everything, a permanent mark. He recalled the dizzying hours, the rhythmic scratch of his pen, the endless procession of faces, each one a silent plea, a desperate prayer. The cramping of his hand, then the surge of an unseen will pushing him through the pain. "Do you ever regret it?" Yukiko's voice was barely a whisper. He paused, the question hanging, heavy and significant. He considered the potential repercussions, the end of his career, the shame to his family, their uncertain future. The criticism, the official reprimands, the hushed conversations. Regret the personal toll? At times, he admitted, his gaze drifting to the window, to the vibrant, indifferent world beyond. It's human to fear loss, but regret the deed itself? No. Never. His voice firmed, infused with quiet conviction. How could I have faced myself in the mirror? How could I have met our children's eyes, knowing I possessed the means to help, and simply turned away? He turned back to her, his gaze clear. The alternative? It was unthinkable. To stand idly by and observe, to be a mere cog in a machinery that ground people into dust. That, I could not do. Quote, Yukiko smiled, a warmth in her eyes that reached him. I knew you wouldn't. She moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. Remember our departure, the train station, the throngs. The memory was a sharp, poignant pang. He replayed it all. The undulating sea of faces, a multitude of strangers, their eyes wide with a desperate gratitude that constricted his throat. The shouts of, Sugihara, Sugihara, echoing through the station, a chorus of hope and relief. The frantic pressing of hands through the train window, the whispered blessings, the tears. The sensation of being simultaneously overwhelmed and profoundly, utterly fulfilled. It was staggering, Chiune said, his voice a little hoarse. To comprehend that, even for a fleeting moment, we had made a difference. That those humble slips of paper, those crude signatures, held the power to grant a future. And the little girl, Yukiko added, her eyes distant, reliving the scene. The one who pressed the small flower into your hand. Do you remember? He nodded slowly. A dandelion. So delicate, yet so tenacious. He had pressed it between the pages of his diary for a long time, its fragile beauty a constant memento. That's precisely what they were, Chiune, Yukiko said softly. Fragile, but possessed of an incredible will to survive. And you gave them that chance. Quote, later that evening, after the children were asleep, Chiune sat in the quiet living room. A letter from the foreign ministry lay on the low table before him, a formal reprimand, a stark reminder of protocol, and a thinly veiled threat to his career. He picked it up, feeling the crisp paper. The words were cold, impersonal, devoid of any comprehension of the human drama that had unfolded. He reread the final paragraph. Your actions have created significant diplomatic complications, and have been deemed a severe breach of official conduct. Further such deviations will result in immediate dismissal. He placed the letter back on the table, exhaling slowly. The words held sway, yes, but not over him, not any longer. He had crossed a threshold, a Rubicon of conscience, and there was no retreating. The strictures of bureaucracy now seemed distant, almost trifling, compared to the indelible imprint left by the faces of those he had aided. He recalled a conversation with a fellow diplomat, a man who had adhered strictly to orders, scoffing at Chiune's reckless compassion. Duty is duty, Sugihara, the man had declared, his voice devoid of emotion. We are instruments of the state, not of our personal feelings. Chiune had simply nodded, knowing even then that he could never truly assent. His duty, he now understood, extended beyond the written mandate, beyond the dictates of a distant ministry. His duty was to humanity itself. He surveyed the room, at the familiar objects, the worn armchair, the stacks of books, the children's toys scattered on the rug, his family, his sanctuary. They were the true measure of his prosperity, his achievement. And he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within him, that he would face any repercussion, endure any hardship, if it meant preserving his integrity, his humanity. The lingering impact of his decision was not merely a personal sentiment, it was a palpable shift in his world, a new lens through which he viewed everything. The future, uncertain as it remained, no longer held the same terrors. He had confronted a profound moral dilemma, and had chosen the path of conviction. That choice, he knew, would define the remainder of his life, a quiet, unshakable testament to the power of a single compassionate act. The memory of those faces, those desperate, hopeful eyes, would be his lodestar, guiding him through whatever lay ahead. He had no regrets, only a profound, quiet understanding of the cost and the immeasurable value of a life lived with purpose.